can only say in principle, in general, that repressive migration policies for sure only serve to slow down the movement of people. It's impossible to stop it, no matter how repressive a policy may be. I would also say that migration is, and I will argue for that, and I think we all agree, because this is why we're here for, migration is also the foundation of international cooperation, of international interaction. Globalism is all about it. Interestingly enough, somebody mentioned, I think it was the German participant here, you mentioned the Declaration on Human Rights. Yes, indeed, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the adoption and signing of the Declaration of Human Rights. And probably I'll be jumping back and forth with references to the international system, because one of the many challenges we have to face is a review, a revisiting of the international system as we've known it for decades. So basically, this is what's on trial now. The whole system, the international system, the United Nations itself, because I will also speak about the compact on migration of the UN. But if you remember, the UN was founded also practically on the embers of World War II. The UN system, the United Nations, emerged a response to immense human suffering and human loss. And things have changed since. There are generations already in the plural that don't remember that. Actually, I don't remember that time either, but it was sooner than your generation or your generation. So you read about a war, as I did. We never experienced it. But with time, memories tend to fade away. And this is why the real reason, the imperative, I would say, because of which the whole international system was created, also seems somehow to become more theoretical, more kind of hard to explain even as a rationale. And this is why it is possible today, and this is in response or in continuation of the previous discussion, this is why it is easy for political parties today, especially newly emerged political parties, to abuse of certain principles, certain, so to say, concepts that the world has lived with for decades on end. Actually, this has been happening to all the instruments, international instruments on migration in particular. Actually, political parties have used the efforts to arrive at some kind of a more universal agreement in order to spread not just disinformation, but also fear. The big question is, why is it possible? Why does it take ground if we are also kind of confident and clear in our minds that we are on the right track? Actually, what is happening around is also due to that kind of interpretation of some international documents, is a growing, a growing fear of a rising threat of disaster displacement of people. Now, again, going back to the events of two and a half years ago, and again, we will be mentioning Germany. I will be mentioning Germany, and a great lady, Chancellor Merkel, despite of the hard times she's going through. What basically triggered it off was her desire to make welcome over 1 million immigrants in this country in 2015, 2016. The terrorist acts that followed and the loss of human life, absolutely senselessly, absolutely irrationally. Just remember France, the sequence there, Germany, Berlin, Strasbourg just the other day. all that does not help the efforts of let's say, long-term ambitions and intentions to create kind of a bigger than one national society, broader and bigger society of people, of humans, than we've been used to. I also come from the Cold War time. I've lived, almost 30 years in a democratic environment, but I've lived also, okay, I'll make a confession, more than 30 years in pre-1990 in the Cold War time. And I know what is now being taken up. They say, okay, in those times we were well protected. There was no immigration, there was no radicalism, etc., because of these repressive politics that I mentioned to you at the beginning of my thoughts. So anyway, Europe was totally unprepared for this influx of as I say, hundreds of thousands of people who were seeking not just refuge, because once you have an immigrant, once you have a refugee, you have to take care of the person, of the people. Of course, it means shelter, it means food, it means job, it means schooling for the children. It is a much bigger package than one would think. So it's not just a life-saving operation, it's much bigger than that. And Europe was unprepared. This is why small crises started erupting in individual European countries. Some were handled fairly well, others less well. Now, I like good humor, and I also kind of appreciate self-irony. This is why I'll be talking to you briefly about my own country. Now we boast the least number of immigrants, and that's of course due to a number of international factors, and I'll mention Turkey here, but it is also true to an ironically sad fact. They just didn't want to stay forever in Bulgaria. The ambition is to move to the north, to the Scandinavian countries, to here, to Germany, to France. So as I keep ironically joking with our own situation, I say, okay, at least there is one positive to the fact that our own people are struggling, and I'm stopping here because I'm not here to talk about one individual country and my own. But anyway, this is what has been happening. Fences started emerging in Europe, in some countries, my own included, frantically, in panic. Now we have a fence with Turkey, which is object now to a corruption investigation because it started kind of breaking at some points. So now we're wondering how many kind of clandestine or irregular immigrants it will stop. So then the other thing which happened was, again in panic, an attempt to negotiate somehow in a brisk, in a temporary fashion, somehow stop them. So that's how this very, I don't know how to call it, so I won't call it anything. No descriptions, no qualifications. The deal with Turkey happened. It helped us for sure, it helped Europe for sure, against the price of 3 billion euro. And from what I hear, there's another 3 billion ready to be handed over to Mr. Erdogan, only for making him kind of quiet in keeping Syrian refugees in particular, but also Afghani refugees on his territory. Interestingly enough, a similar approach is now believed to work with Egypt, because the first ever EU-Arab summit is to happen in February, next February, in Egypt. And obviously the hope is that Mr. El-Sisi will also be susceptible to getting some money against keeping, using his coastal guard to keep immigration or movement, transfer of immigrants from other North Mediterranean countries to Europe. Now, it is also fair to say that the numbers have gone down. Nothing compared to what used to be 2 years ago. The numbers have gone down, obviously because of this deal with Erdogan, because of strengthening borders, and I'll come to that, a very important measure, obviously, to be taken by the European Union countries, and mostly by the coastal countries. So it's not just Bulgaria, but it's mostly Greece, Italy, Spain, where the main impact of immigrants comes. So the hope is that somehow the coastal guard of Egypt will stop immigrants from moving up the Mediterranean. Anyway, the European Union countries knew that they had to act fast, that they were already behind the curve, not ahead of the curve, and that they could only design some remedies to handle the current situation and think in terms of long-term strategies and measures. This is how the European agenda on migration came into being, which is the joint European effort to handle the problem. But again, the situation remains fragile, and because it is due to ongoing migration pressure. The migration of, as I would describe them, irregular immigrants has not died away at all. So there are new routes, actually, in the Mediterranean, which are mostly along the eastern and the western Mediterranean routes. There are also seasonal peaks. Obviously, in better weather, in better seasons, the numbers go up. So there were several goals to achieve with this, or to pursue at least. Achievement is a different thing. To pursue with the European agenda on migration. First of all, to have all the countries together at the table, and to make sure that we all talk the same language and we are all ready to arrive at some kind of a compromise, because obviously there is no ideal solution. I've spent times in Parliament. For 11 years I was a member of Parliament in my country, and I've learned the hard way that there is no ideal legislation, and everybody, all parties to the legislation, should be a little bit unhappy about it. Because if you have just one party happy and the other one unhappy, it's no go. You go back to zero. So keep everybody a little bit unhappy in order to, this is kind of a human thing again, psychology, that is a kind of a psychological comfort that one is not alone in his or her unhappiness. So basically, one of the main goals was to fill in gaps along the European border, which means both coastal and land borders. Improving return, checks on the border, of course, that was almost non-existent, because we were all living in the romanticism of Schengen. Europe of no borders, everybody welcome. This is such a nice idyllic picture, but I would also take it back to ancient Greece. No one knows what was then and there, but we all imagine it as the land of ultimate happiness and harmony. So that was a dream which was abruptly discontinued in Europe, and that's why immediately all the countries started strengthening up their borders and beefing up the borders, on the basis of European decisions, of course. And here again, there were kind of serious arguments, because it was all again about money, who gets how much, which country, I mean, gets how much. And it is true, there was some kind of a, I would call it, well, if not fair, at least respectful of hardships distribution of funds to all, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, Spain, all got European funds to fortify the borders. Then the checks. It is sad indeed, but it is true to reality. The fingerprints. The concept and the model of a blue card. That is after the fashion of the green card in America. So in order to work in the European Union, to have the right to work, you have to be approved for a blue card, which is, as you may understand, not an automatic process. To improve returns, in order, not to have those buffer zones when you have really crowds of people who are nowhere. There are no citizens, no passports, no legitimate settlement. So that was one of the very big challenges. So gradually improve returns and boost resettlement. Another one was, and this is again in the mentality, in the how should I say, in the concept of Europe, one whole and free, to protect the migrants. I'm not to tell you about how many migrants suffered, how many lost their lives either in sea or at sea or crossing over by land. So that's another important goal to better protect the migrants. Another important goal is to target and eventually neutralize the criminal smuggling networks. You would also know that this is a very, very lucrative business. I can give you numbers of examples just with our own route, our own passage, but that's true for everywhere. So very quickly that developed into a business which was addressed as well as a very big challenge. And as I said, help the frontline states, which happened to the extent possible. The biggest challenge, though, besides breaking the business model of smugglers, is to address the root causes. And this is something which Europe cannot do alone. This needs to be done in a much bigger partnership, partnering with the countries of origin, and that is not the easiest thing to do. But definitely this is kind of goal, task, and challenge number one, to address the root causes. Now, what happened was very, very recently, at a European Council, was an attempt to improve and to expand the so-called asylum laws. And here is, and improve the entire EU asylum system, which again means strengthening the borders and handling in a regulated fashion the migrants who come to Europe. What happened, though, and that's another sad kind of thing. I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but basically the result of this last council was kind of a further step towards building a fortress Europe by strengthening the borders and the procedures, the border procedures, and at the same time outsourcing the responsibility to the countries of Northern Africa. Europe is trying indeed to kind of shed the responsibility which it had shouldered initially, because initially it was all Europe. It may not be easy, but it has to be done in cooperation with the countries of Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa as well, because there are large numbers that come from Sub-Saharan Africa. I have dotted down some notes which make me remember my very, very valuable thoughts. And what I've written here, the Bloc's biggest political crisis, and this is absolutely true. That's why I'm constantly thinking of the romantic times before. Europe has never been faced with such a serious, such a deep-going political crisis. So countries of Europe, the European Union countries, they actually bickered over who should take responsibility and whether the European countries, whether we should help. Because in actual honesty, if there is a refugee sharing quota, it can be challenged in court. And countries are not very much in favor of a refugee sharing quota. Maybe you have read in the media how it was ridiculously kind of unevenly distributed. Again, my country cannot boast of any contribution, a voluntary contribution, to take part of this responsibility, based on many domestic factors, which are also legitimate, like standards of living, unemployment rates, etc. But this was the first, which was over a year ago, the first very serious bickering about how, and is it possible at all to have the refugees fairly distributed among the European member countries. The foundation of Europe's asylum system, as I said, the migrants stay in the country they first arrive in, was the goal. And it still remains a ticking policy time bomb, because how do you apply this asylum principle by returning the asylum seekers back to the first port of entry? My own country reacted to that because of the same reasons. So this is, as I say, a ticking time bomb, political time bomb, and the European Union, we have not been able to defuse it. So this is ongoing, and it will continue to be a matter of very heated arguments within the Union. As I said earlier, the only thing that has really worked so far was money, big money. But how long can you go with this? This is not something, because that's again the European funds that are to be distributed. So that is also something which, as I said, the European Union will try to do with Egypt, with regard to also countries like Morocco, Niger, Tunisia. Libya has been the source of most people entering Europe, and this is why it is expected that the Mediterranean countries will, I mean, Egypt in particular. I know why you're coming to me. I've heard you, I've seen you, but I also have my logic to follow. This is the attempt to make sure that Libya, which is the source of most of, not as Libyans, but as a route, as an itinerary, will be somehow controlled as well. So I did mention Egypt to you. And yes, and this is my probably most illustrative point, and my dear chair of the session, I cannot go without it. And this is the UN Pact on Migration, which was just voted in Marrakesh by 164 countries, but that's something you would appreciate. Only last July, when it was still in New York with the UN, it was approved by everybody. So can you imagine the position of the perm reps of the countries out there in New York who vote, because it's theoretical. Of course, we are all in favor of supporting migrants, of making sure that it is a smooth process, etc. But when it came to the vote of the governments, the situation changed. There were defectors, I would call them, from the pact, from the compact, and the number is growing up, unfortunately. Most visible and telling example is Austria. Austria, that negotiated the compact as a president of the European Union, stepped away. The US were at least consistent. They said no last July, and they just said we are out of it. Now we have a large number of countries which will probably be growing. And this is not just Austria. This is my own country, Bulgaria. This is the Czech Republic. It's Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Lithuania. Italy is still considering whether to sign or not. And now the big question is why? Because if you go to the text of this compact, there's nothing wrong with it. It's first of all legally non-binding. It is a technical document. It only deals with some very basic technical parameters. It is supposed to help organize safe, orderly, and humane movement of people. And this is a quote from the compact itself. So although it aims to better handle the rising flows of migration worldwide, it is still being faced with more and more distrust. This is the key to it, distrust. And this is why the countries are kind of backing away. This distrust became possible as a result of this unpreparedness of kind of meeting and handling the large numbers of people, which was used by extreme radical parties. And while the numbers of migrants are going down, the wave of radical, populist, anti-migrant parties, this wave, political wave, has not receded yet. So the big challenge will be how to make sure that the trend, the political trend of radicalism will be contained, because it has long left the origin, the factor that originated it, the migration itself. Is Europe splitting? I think it is not. It is kind of struggling. It will be reinvented, the European Union, not Europe as a whole, because we know that there may be some who are out. There are those who have never been in, like Norway and Switzerland. So if we refer to the European Union, which has its own kind of legal binding straps, I don't think it will fall apart. The stakes are too high, especially of the newcomers. We found a new kind of identity, so to say, when we joined the EU. But it will be redefined. It will definitely need to face the new realities, which goes through also for the United Nations, the way it was started, as I mentioned at the beginning, 70 years ago. So my very dear conferees, we are in for a rather long journey of reshaping, readapting, reinventing the international organizations we've been used to live with and in. Thank you. This is, now speaking of human rights, I didn't even touch on human rights, because the big contradiction here is human rights versus migration. That's the big question.
Let me explain you.
I'm joking. I'm joking.
First of all, it's already more than 5 o'clock. Well, we have to go to take a picture, by the way, just after that. My apology is to the next speaker. That will be after the break, after the photo. The photo will be taken over there, on our right, at the entrance.
The entrance was the big black banner,
Yeah.
as I see.
Yeah. Secondly, what to do? Everything interesting, everything interesting. But I have to find a way to satisfy everybody within the limited time. So, your question.
Can I make a very quick comment?
It is very
Okay,
quick.
yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Michaela. I was born in the Republic of Moldova, but I've been a Portuguese.
I heard your first question. I followed your debate.
Half of
Yeah,
my
right.
life, and I've recently graduated from the UK. Got the pleasure to actually be there, be a part of the society when Brexit happens. And talking about migration, like obviously made by people who are running from something bad towards something better. You've mentioned refugees and asylum seekers. However, migration is not about that only. While being in the UK, the biggest issue was with Europeans that go into the UK, so that would be part of the issue. Now, I see that migration it's not a cause, it's a consequence of the way the system works and what it explicitly, but mostly implicitly, kind of advertises. So that doesn't make it the heart of the issue. What is your take on that? Shouldn't the EU government and actually all the countries in the world take a look at actually why are people migrating? Because if you deal with that issue, migration would naturally be reduced without having to be
This is an easy question to ask and a very difficult one to answer, because then we go into the very serious and complicated matter of the difference between migrants and asylum seekers. It is no accident that I was using both. So migrants are normally people who are looking for a better life. Asylum seekers are those who are running for their life. So it is not easy to accommodate all those who either want to live more comfortably or not even more comfortably, but to have bread and butter, which may be the result of abject poverty. But it is not a universal case, and this is why it is so complicated, and this is why the border controls, because at least there should be a certitude that you're really helping someone in real need, because you have your own at home. You see, it's not an easy solution.
Migration splitting Europe apart. The migration is everything. So within Europe, there are countries like the UK.
No, that's a different thing. That's Brexit. That's Brexit. That's a different one.
The UK is
Yeah, and UK were promised, or actually Europeans were promised that by UK that there won't be consequences for the Europeans, for the EU citizens living there. So but that's an easy thing. I mean, it may be kind of unpleasant. It can be unwanted, but this is still within the family. You know, like a divorce this is why it's called divorce, within the family. We are talking of a different thing. We are talking of an unknown and hardly to measure impact from outside on Europe, which has to be handled. And again, the big thing is human rights and migration. The migration, by the way, by all international instruments, is a matter of national sovereignty. So each country is not only allowed to, but it is kind of guaranteed to make its own decisions with regard to migration. This is written down. On the other hand, migration intervenes among all countries. So there must be also a bigger kind of union solution. So how do you handle, and the big question of sovereignty, that's another one. How do you handle sovereignty versus your belonging to a union? I'm afraid I won't be tolerated anymore on this stage, so...
Short question, short answer.
I'll be very short. My name is Stefano Casellini. I'm a Switzerland.
Allora, passiamo italiano?
I'm actually from Switzerland.
Oh, you're from Switzerland. I thought I'll talk to a subject of sufferer from migration.
Switzerland on your list.
I did mention because you're not...
Hasn't signed the UN Pact on Migration yet, and I can answer you, but just because it came at a very wrong moment for the inner politics.
I didn't mention Switzerland. I didn't know that you were part on the... You may have joined the list late.
So my question is very quickly, do you believe that this pact might be negotiated again in the future to take into account the different positions of the countries who are not yet on the boat of this pact?
Since it has already been signed by 164, I doubt it. You can also ask me if the climate change pact would be negotiated again. No, it won't. I don't even know whether Brexit will be negotiated again. So I doubt it, to be serious. I doubt it. They're so glad to have somehow pushed it on that I don't think anybody is ready to start again. And it's technical, it's general, it gives you national sovereignty guarantees, it gives you, I mean, everything you can, the rejection is because of domestic situations. And this is why I mentioned that the worst part of it is that while migration may kind of come down to normal numbers, the other tide, the other tendency in international politics and national politics is on the rise. It needs to somehow be receded.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you.